You probably think the biggest threat to a cowboy on the frontier was a bullet from a revolver or a rattlesnake in the boot. But they had mastered terrifying techniques for dealing with starvation that would make modern survivalists vomit. Here is the thing about the Wild West that sounds completely backwards. Having plenty of gold in your saddlebags when you were stranded in the Rockies wouldn't save you. It would actually weigh you down and kill you faster. Yeah, you heard that right. The endless horizon is literally everywhere around you. But taking even a few steps in the wrong direction makes your body panic and start shutting down. The caloric deficit in a freezing winter storm is about 3 times higher than what your body can handle on standard rations. When you stop eating, your body desperately tries to keep your brain alive by pulling energy from your fat and muscles. You end up consuming yourself from the inside out, losing more body mass in a day than you could gain in a week of feasting. It is like trying to heat a log cabin by burning the walls that hold the roof up. Pioneers figured this out the hard way during those brutal months crossing the Continental Divide. Wagons back then were basically rolling wooden boxes with pathetic storage space. Food supplies took up massive room in crates, and trail bosses had to choose between carrying more flour and bacon or more tools for mining and building a new life. Most chose the tools, thinking they would hunt for game later. Bad choice. Caravans would watch their food supplies dwindle, mile after dusty mile. Desperate settlers would sneak extra rations when no one was looking, only to realize that the game had migrated south and the forests were empty, silent graveyards. Their stomachs would cramp up, they would get severe lethargy, and their minds would start playing tricks on them. Some cowboys reported seeing banquets of roasted meats on the snowy horizon that were not actually there. The smart trail guides quickly learned that hunger could destroy a caravan faster than any bandit raid. Stories spread through every saloon about parties found frozen in mountain passes, their bodies untouched, but their supplies completely gone. These were not just scary tales, they were warnings. A strip of dried jerky became more valuable than a bag of gold dust. Seriously, frontiersmen would guard their hardtack barrels like bank vaults because that is exactly what they were. When flour ran low, even the most God-fearing family men would turn violent. Shootouts started over the last piece of salt pork more often than over poker games. Legendary scout Kit Carson himself once implied that his biggest fear wasn't the Comanche or the grizzly. It was running out of protein with 3 weeks left in the high country. Smart travelers realized they needed to become survival experts or risk watching their families die of starvation in the middle of the world's most unforgiving wilderness. The irony was perfect and deadly. Prospectors spent their lives chasing silver and gold veins in the earth, but the most precious material on the trail was completely organic and perishable. Meat meant survival, and survival meant everything else became possible. But here is where the pioneers got creative. They started developing tricks that would make modern nutritionists horrified. After learning that starvation was basically a slow-motion death sentence, cowboys had to get creative fast. Their first instinct? Look at their transport and pray for a miracle. But they couldn't just stand there with their mouths open like confused cattle. Smart groups rigged up elaborate soup kitchens using whatever they had. Saddles and boots became dinner. Leather gear was boiled for hours until it turned into a gummy, flavorless paste that barely resembled food. The trick was boiling it just right so the tannins and chemicals used in tanning didn't poison you, instead of providing a tiny bit of collagen to keep your heart beating. Makes sense, right? Here is where it gets interesting, though. Pioneers quickly discovered that eating treated leather was like trying to digest a belt that had been soaking in industrial chemicals for years. gross. So they developed a preparation routine, scrubbing their gear thoroughly before any boiling attempt. This meant precious time and fuel spent on preparation, but it was worth avoiding that nasty chemical burn in the gut. Then there were the bones. Cowboys became surprisingly good at improvised extraction, creating tools to crush and smash animal bones from carcasses they found along the trail. These makeshift hammers could crack open even the thickest bison femurs to get to the marrow inside. Some groups got so good at this that they could harvest thousands of calories from a skeleton picked clean by wolves days ago. But wait, it gets weirder. When leather wasn't enough, desperate pioneers turned to their working animals. They would look at their beloved horses and oxen not as friends, but as walking pantries. The amount of meat was significant, maybe hundreds of pounds per animal. But every kill counted when you were dying of hunger. The real problem with all these methods? You can't ride a horse, you just ate. Killing your transport meant you were stranded, gambling that you could walk out of the wilderness before the meat spoiled or ran out. Unfortunately, the winter snows were not always cooperative, which forced pioneers to look for more reliable solutions. They needed something that didn't depend on finding a stray deer or sacrificing their mobility. Something they could control themselves, even when the blizzards stayed stubbornly fierce for weeks. Pioneers might have thought they solved their food problems once they butchered a horse, but storing the stuff? That was a nightmare wrapped in hide and sealed with false hope. Every wagon train carried supplies, but fresh meat in the summer heat or damp winter rot didn't stay fresh for long. We are talking about massive cuts of flesh that would start rotting from the inside out, turning your precious dinner into a slimy, foul-smelling mess that tasted like death. Bacteria absolutely loved these warm, moist environments and threw parties that would make your stomach turn inside out. Then there is the disease problem nobody talks about. These animals weren't always healthy. They had been worked to the bone, starving themselves. Your fresh steak would pick up parasites and diseases from the exhausted host. One day you are eating horse stew. The next you have trichinosis, or worse. Makes sense, right? Flesh decays like clockwork. Pioneers discovered the hard way that their carefully rationed horse meat would turn into toxic waste within days, sometimes hours in hot weather. The irony was brutal. You could die of starvation while surrounded by pounds of meat that would make you sicker than drinking arsenic. Well, desperate times called for desperate measures. Cowboys weren't exactly known for giving up easily, especially when their lives depended on it. They started experimenting, trying anything that might keep their protein from turning into a science experiment gone wrong. Some groups tried salting the meat heavily, hoping it would burn out the rot. Others smoked it over damp fires, constantly moving the cuts to prevent any one piece from getting too moist. But these were just temporary fixes for a problem that demanded real solutions. And the weird part is, the answer was literally staring them in the face every time they looked at their fellow travelers. The solution involved the ultimate taboo, moral flexibility, and a technique that would forever stain the history of the West. The pioneers were about to become accidental monsters, and their next discovery would change everything about frontier survival forever. Settlers weren't exactly known for their philosophical breakthroughs, but desperate times called for desperate ethics. When your party was dying of hunger and your leather boots tasted like chemical despair, you get creative fast. Here is where things get really dark. Some clever, or perhaps sociopathic, traveler figured out that the frozen bodies of their fallen comrades could actually save the rest of the group. They started deliberating the unthinkable. It sounds crazy. Well, this dark logic was pure survival instinct disguised as madness. The process was simple, but horrific. When a member of the party died from exposure or starvation, the survivors wouldn't bury them in the frozen ground. They would strip the flesh from the bones, carefully avoiding the organs that might carry disease. They would stop before they lost their humanity completely. Or so they told themselves, leaving behind the face or hands to maintain some semblance of respect. Then they would cook this forbidden meat and wait for the hunger to subside. And the weird part is, it actually worked. That protein wasn't just sustenance. It was high-calorie fuel that the body desperately craved. The human body contains roughly 125,000 calories, enough to keep a small group alive for days. Think of it as the world's most horrific emergency ration, utilized by people who read the Bible every Sunday. Pioneers noticed that those who partook in the flesh regained their strength faster. Instead of fading away into the snow, these survivors could hike for miles, their muscles fueled by the very people who had walked beside them days ago. The meat didn't just fill their bellies. It provided the essential fats that lean rabbit or deer meat lacked. What makes this even more amazing is that these pioneers accidentally stumbled onto a biological reality we understand today. Rabbit starvation is a condition caused by eating only lean protein. You starve to death with a full stomach because you lack fat. Humans, unlike wild rabbits, have fat stores. By consuming their fallen friends, they were curing their protein poisoning. Modern nutritionists know this works because the human body is perfectly adapted to digest, meat. Pioneers weren't trying to be ghouls. They just wanted to see the spring thaw. The Donner Party method spread quickly among trapped expeditions because it actually saved lives. Word travels fast when you find something that keeps your children from dying of starvation. Trail guides started whispering about the custom of the sea applied to the land. But even this horrific trick had limitations. You have to wait for someone to die naturally, and waiting meant getting weaker. Pioneers needed backup plans when passive scavenging wasn't enough. Then there is something even more surprising that cowboys discovered about the hierarchy of survival. They found that establishing a lottery system created almost magical results for group cohesion that seemed impossible to believe. While some were busy praying and others were losing their minds, some clever leaders discovered something fascinating. Drawing straws or flipping coins to decide who would be sacrificed wasn't just murder. It was accidental genius. Those short and long straws weren't there for a game. They were there for order. Here is what happened. Groups that relied on chaos and murder often fell apart due to infighting and paranoia. But groups that ritualized the sacrifice, making it a fair game of chance, stayed cohesive longer. The winners didn't turn on each other in a frenzy. They accepted the grim reality with a strange calmness. It didn't feel like a crime after 2 weeks of starvation. It felt like a duty. Makes sense, right? Well, cowboys didn't know they were dealing with complex game theory and social psychology. A structured sacrifice reduces the cognitive load of decision-making in high-stress environments. Modern science proves this works because predictable rules, even horrific ones, lower cortisol levels and prevent the fight-or-flight panic that burns precious calories. Frontiersmen stumbled onto this centuries before anyone understood group dynamics in crisis. They just knew their group lasted longer when the decision of who died next was left to chance rather than strength. But here is the weird part. Some survivors swore the meat of a sacrificed victim tasted better too. cleaner, less like eating a corpse and more like accepting a gift. Survivors would argue over which method of selection was fairest. The really smart leaders hoarded the straws specifically for this moment. When the horses were gone, they would keep the lottery system ready. Hope could run out, prayer could disappear. But the lottery? That was life or death. Real treasure meant staying alive long enough to explain what you did to the authorities. Then there is the practical side. A controlled sacrifice was easier to process than a frantic murder. Unlike a chaotic brawl where energy is wasted and meat is damaged, a calm execution ensured the resource was harvested efficiently. Cowboys could butcher the body, preserve the meat, and distribute it evenly, recycling at its finest. Modern military survival training still discusses the psychology of impossible decisions for the same reasons. Of course, the lottery wasn't perfect. It couldn't fix a mind that had already snapped. It worked best as a last resort, not a first option. Smart pioneers learned to discuss these possibilities early, in hushed tones around the fire. The lottery trick spread through the mountain passes faster than the wind. Captains who ignored this method often found themselves sleeping with one eye open, wondering which crew member was looking at them like a pork chop. But even the lottery had its limitations when the storms lasted weeks and the group dwindled down to just 2 people. That is when pioneers needed something more dramatic than straws and luck. While drawing lots helped keep the group order, cowboys still faced their biggest nightmare: being surrounded by endless snow, alone with one other person they couldn't trust. That is when the craftiest survivors turn to what sounds like pure evil, turning a companion into a pantry through purely predatory instincts. The process wasn't new, but the mountain men had to get creative with their moral justifications. Track the prey, wait for them to sleep, strike quickly, and boom, the hunger is gone. Simple in theory, absolutely brutal in practice when your prey is a man you have shared coffee with for 3 months. Alferd Packer, the infamous Colorado cannibal, became a legend for this. He didn't wait for his companions to die of natural causes. He allegedly accelerated the process. His peers thought he was a monster until they realized this ruthlessness allowed him to walk out of the San Juan Mountains looking surprisingly well-fed. The setup involved separating the group, isolating the weakest members, and striking when their defenses were down. But here is where it gets interesting and dangerous. This predatory approach needed constant vigilance because one wrong move could result in you becoming the dinner instead of the diner. Packers and men like Boone Helm had to balance the need for sleep with the need to kill. Talk about high-stakes hunting. The energy problem was massive too. Every calorie spent wrestling a companion was a calorie that couldn't be used for hiking out. Some survivors got so desperate they started hunting the hunters. It became a game of 4D chess played with hatchets and Bowie knives. The tension must have been absolutely terrible. Then, there is the speed issue nobody talks about. These violent confrontations were incredibly risky. We are talking about a 50-50 chance of survival if the other guy fights back. A starving man might be weak, but adrenaline is a powerful drug. Smart predators learned to time their strikes perfectly. They would wait until the target was deep in hypothermic sleep, when the body stops shivering and just drifts away. Makes it easier to manage the harvest. Some killers even took turns staying awake to watch the others, creating a standoff that could last for days. The weapons they used often came from the very tools they brought to find fortune. Pickaxes, skinning knives, even heavy skillets. Ironic that their tools of trade became their utensils for the forbidden feast. Frontiersmen discovered that a heavy object worked better than a gun because the noise of a gunshot doesn't echo. But the psychological impact of a silent kill keeps you hidden from others. Of course, predation wasn't their only trick. When strength ran low or the guilt became too risky, pioneers had to get even more creative with their survival methods. While the lottery and murder were effective solutions, they were morally expensive. Cowboys didn't stop there. Desperate times called for desperate measures, and some lone wanderers got downright creative with their preservation tricks. The most popular backup plan? Turning human flesh into jerky. Now, this wasn't about a snack for the road, though that was a grim side effect. Pioneers discovered that smoking strips of long pig over a low fire actually preserved the meat for weeks. The smoke acted like a preservative, keeping their precious protein supply edible for the long trek down the mountain. Smart, right? But smoking wasn't the only weapon in their arsenal. Some survivors swore by freezing the meat in the snow. The natural freezer of the Rockies didn't just hide the evidence. It kept the meat from spoiling. They would bury cuts of meat in deep snowdrifts, marking the spots with sticks. Cowboys would also toss in whatever spices they had left in their pockets: gunpowder, salt, tobacco, anything to mask the distinct, sweet taste of human flesh. Then there were the really desperate attempts. Picture a mountain man trying to boil human bones into a broth using a rusted tin cup and melted snow. Some tried grinding the bones into a powder to mix with water, believing the calcium would keep them moving. Did it work? Sometimes. Was it pretty gross? Absolutely. The weirdest concoction had to be what some called trapper's stew. This bizarre dish mixed strips of leather, pine needles, and chunks of dubious meat. Anything to make the situation more bearable. It probably tasted awful, but it was better than the void of starvation. Of course, not every experiment ended well. Some pioneers tried eating the liver of polar bears or strange mountain fungi, thinking wild meat was safe. What they didn't know was that certain organs accumulate toxic levels of vitamin A, or that specific mushrooms would shut down their kidneys faster than hunger. Cowboys would get sick, blind, and confused without understanding why their wild feast was killing them. The trial and error approach cost lives, but it also led to genuine discoveries about what the human body can endure. Pioneers were basically walking laboratories, testing wild theories about metabolism and digestion while fighting for survival on the frozen peaks. While these makeshift solutions kept some alive, the most innovative survivors were already working on something far more ambitious. Some mountain men were experimenting with techniques that went way beyond simple butchery. Methods that could actually transform the psychology of the survivor. When regular survival skills weren't cutting it, cowboys got creative with their minds. These tough drifters made perfect candidates for a psychological shift. They would detach themselves from the reality of what they were eating. They convinced themselves that the meat wasn't Jim or Sarah, but simply bison or deer. This mental gymnastics allowed them to bypass the deep-seated evolutionary revulsion to cannibalism. They would carve the meat into shapes that didn't look human. They would avoid eye contact with the source. They created a mental barrier that acted like a blast shield for their sanity. They'd hang the meat high in trees, away from the sleeping area, to separate food from friend. The cold air acted as a natural refrigerator, and the distance acted as a psychological buffer. Cowboys could then lower the meat when needed, cook it quickly, and eat it without looking too closely. Gross? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. But why stop at mental tricks when you could use the environment? Some survivors discovered that burying the meat in the permafrost created natural lockers. The Earth's steady temperature worked to keep the meat frozen solid, preventing the scent from attracting wolves or bears. The meat would stay preserved, hidden under feet of snow and dirt. This method took patience, but it worked even when they were too weak to hunt. Then there is the soup trick that sounds almost too logical. Pioneers noticed that boiling the meat until it fell apart destroyed the visual evidence of what it was. When mixed with water and boiled for hours, the fibers separated. It became just a hot, calorie-dense sludge. No fingers, no distinct muscles, just fuel. The process wasn't perfect, but it reduced the psychological horror enough to make the meal edible. Pots and pans became the agents of this transformation. Let's not forget the campfires sitting around doing nothing between meals. Experienced survivors figured out they could use the ash to cure the meat. They would rub the wood ash into the raw strips. The lye in the ash helped preserve the flesh and keep the flies away. Who knew the remnants of their warmth could help preserve their horrific fuel? And the weird part is, what happened when they finally reached civilization? These survivors had developed a 1,000-yard stare that unsettled everyone they met. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They carried the secret in their bellies and in their eyes. While townspeople worried about the price of cattle, these survivors had mastered the darkest economics of all, the value of a human life in calories. They had turned the frontier into a feeding ground where every moral law was suspended in favor of biological necessity. The most successful survivors weren't just good at shooting, they were brilliant at compartmentalizing. They turned their trauma into a tool. While regular folks fainted at the sight of blood, seasoned cannibals, survivors they called themselves, had mastered the art of seeing the world as nothing but potential energy. They had stripped away the veneer of civilization to reveal the raw, hungry animal underneath. And that is the terrifying truth about the Wild West. It wasn't the gunslinger who was the most dangerous man in the room. It was the quiet guy in the corner who looked at you and didn't see a person, but a roughly 125,000 calorie solution to a temporary problem.